Now we're going to move on and speak about Green Party conference again. If you were listening earlier, you would have heard that we spoke to Jonathan Chilvers, of course, Green Party candidate in Leamington. Well, now we're going to speak to Zack Polanski. Zack is a Green Party candidate and activist and is also the co-founder of the Jewish Greens. Zack, how are you?
I'm great, thank you. How are you?
Good, thank you. Thank you very much for coming on Kingston Green Radio. Just to double check, how was conference? How did you find it?
It was good. It was actually my first Green Party conference. It was buzzing. It was lovely to see new ideas, to see some faces that I've spoken to online for a lot. It's really nice to see Caroline Lucas being a presence, as I'm sure listeners would expect, and also to see Sean Berry and Jonathan Bartley kind of presenting their new kind of future vision for green politics and the green movement.
Yeah, and on those two, I was going to ask you, of course, as you mentioned, Sean Berry, big shoes to fill as the new co-leader of the Green Party, replacing Caroline Lucas. Where we're from, Zack, in the London area, she, of course, is fairly well known. She came third in the last London mayor election. She's standing again, and I think she stood one time before that as well. How do you assess, I know it's been a short period of time, but how do you assess her kind of first few moments as leader of the Green Party, and what can she do to get her name out there a bit more as well?
Yeah, I think it's fun. I think they are big shoes to fill. She's taking the leadership in a different way than Caroline and Jonathan took it. It feels already like it's going to be more led through conference, more about democracy. I won't bore listeners, but the Green Party are going through a major rehaul at the moment called the Holistic Review, which is essentially looking at the very basics of democracy within the party and how things work. And that actually took up a lot of the conference, was just the pure bureaucratic, democratic nature of voting through a new constitution. I think Sean's been really clear, though, in terms of where she wants to take things. I think some of it is out of her hands in terms of she really needs that media time and that media presence. Obviously, it's incumbent on myself, the team, everyone to try and help her get that time. But I think from when she ran as mayoral candidate, that whenever she is on TV or radio, she actually gets her ideas across really well.
And I said to Jonathan Chilvers, who we had on earlier, is of course a Green Party councillor in Leamington, I was asking him about Jonathan Bartley. Now, he's been leader for a fair bit of time now, and I think it's fair to say, Zack, of course, politicos like myself and yourself, we know who Jonathan Bartley is, but, you know, it's fair to say there are still a lot of people who don't necessarily know who he is, and they don't necessarily know quite what the Green Party stands for at the moment. I mean, what can you do to ensure that he cuts through as well, and that the Green Party cuts through on a national level?
So I think there's two things there, and we'll take them in reverse order. One is that people often don't know what the Green Party stands for, but actually I think if ever there's been a zeitgeist and ever a moment for green politics, and it really is now. We, of course, had the report yesterday to show how damaging climate change is going to be and is already, and of course we already knew this, but this is a group of elite scientists printing a report to say it really is much more serious than even some of our worst case scenarios. And actually we've got to do something right now. So I think a huge part of that is for the Green Party to be there and say, Labour sure have shifted to the left slightly under Jeremy Corbyn, but actually it's great that we're fighting for social justice, but we're still going to have a burnt earth and the planet is going to burn. I still think it's crucial, again, that the Green Party are still with social justice politics as well. But I think that the time for kind of the environmental flag to be flown really is now. In terms of Jonathan, I think it links to what I just said, that we have an unfair voting system, a two-party system, and over again, the Green Party have been shoved out of debate, of media time, et cetera, et cetera. Something that was really interesting to hear Jonathan say was that because of a progressive alliance, Labour and essentially Jeremy Corbyn really slammed the door in Jonathan and Caroline's face. And he said, and actually, we're not going to come knocking again. This time it's up for Labour to come knocking. They're going to have to knock really loudly, and they're going to have to come bearing gifts. Now, I don't know what those gifts are. I guess we'll have to see what Labour come up with, but I'd be very surprised if it wasn't proportional representation.
And as you said, you've been a Liberal Democrat before, and we'll get into that a bit more. But of course, something that you've been kind of consistent on is that you want what you call a fair voting system, you know, a kind of proportional system. Is there not an argument to say, Zack, that people like yourself should be perhaps, if you are, you know, describe yourself as left wing, you should perhaps be in the Labour Party, and you should perhaps be pushing for it internally within that party? What would you say to people who would argue that?
Right. I think, first of all, you're right to correct me or at least challenge me that I called it a fair voting system. But I think by any kind of objective measure, it is a fair voting system. It's a voting system where everyone's vote counts, where there's no wasted votes and also no safe seats. So I think if we want a sensible conversation about democracy, and we want to be able to move forward in the future, then I think we really need to get it across to the public that it is a fair voting system. So there's lots of reasons for me not to be in Labour, and I'm trying to turn over somewhat the new leaf and stop bashing Labour and criticise them as a friendly voice. But it's very difficult sometimes because they really don't help themselves. I think until Labour can commit to a fair voting system, I think it can't pretend to have any kind of movement on social justice, on environmental justice or democratic justice. If the leadership at the top of the Labour Party can't accept the basic principle that everyone's vote should count equally, then I don't think we can believe them on other issues either. I also think there's lots of problems with Labour in terms of in policy terms. I mentioned already that their environmental policies tend to be quite polite. I think we need radical reform, not moderate reform. So things like the universal basic income, the 3-day working week, again, proportional representation, but also looking at the whole way that we encounter democracy in our society and how we localize things are all growing movements. And essentially, I think it's fair to say often in Liberal Democrat movements too. I think Labour are a very specific beast and they're not something I'd want to support.
As you touched on then, you were a Liberal Democrat. You were fairly active within the party. I think you applied to be a candidate, indeed, for the Liberal Democrats. Do you have any second thoughts about your defection? Are you pleased you left? Is there a bit of you that wants to work closely with the Lib Dems because of your past affiliation? What's kind of your attitude towards that party now?
I'd love to work closely with the Liberal Democrats. I think the Social Liberal Forum were at the Green Party conference. I spoke to representatives over the weekend and they said that people had on the whole been overwhelmingly friendly, were interested in what it was about. There was no hostility whatsoever, just a few people who were a little bit confused and thought they were trying to recruit to the Liberal Democrats as opposed to saying, these are ways that we can work together. I don't regret defecting at all. I think it was absolutely the right choice. Yet that doesn't mean that I don't have, friends within the party and also many shared principles. I do worry about Liberal Democrats. I think there's a needed party within society. And I think I was about to say ever since I've left, that's not causation or correlation. It just is how it's been. Ever since I've left it, I feel like they have lost their way a little bit. I think Vince Cable's party of moderate speech was deeply misjudged. And I think that it isn't clear what the Liberal Democrats at the moment stand for. And I think they're split in as many ways as the Labour Party are, just because they don't get so much coverage that's not so well known in the media. And that's not me just, firing weapons across the front line, because there are splits in the Green Party too. There's also issues going on. So I think, that's not unique to the Liberal Democrats, but I think they've got a particular problem with it.
Moving on to Brexit now, something, of course, I know you feel very strongly about, and indeed the Green Party feels very strongly about. Could you just outline why? Because there are people, Zack, who still understandably are confused and in some instances angry that there's a call for a second vote. Why do you think we should have one? It is absolutely Green Party policy to have a second vote. And in fact, we passed a motion this weekend to say that if there was a second vote, then the Green Party stance would be to remain. I think that was already pretty implicit, but I'm pleased that, that is now in our manifesto, so to speak, or in our policy rules. It's not a manifesto yet because we don't have an election yet, but we will be campaigning to remain. That's very true. It feels like it could be coming any day now. I think it's really important for the reasons that are often rehearsed, but they're worth saying. That first of all, it's not a second referendum. It would be a third referendum because we had a vote in 1975. This would not be a referendum. We would not just be rerunning the referendum. This would be a referendum on the terms of the deal. So I think Liberal Democrats often say, and it's a nice line, that we voted for a departure, but we didn't vote for a destination. And I think it's very clear from the government's behaviour over the last 18 months to 2 years that they absolutely have no idea what's going on. They really have been jumping off a sinking ship. I think that even if you didn't accept the very idea that things haven't been fair or that they broke the spending rules or there were lots of lies told during the referendum, I think you have to accept the idea that almost nobody thinks this is a good idea. So even if everything had been completely legit, do we really want as a government, as a country, to go forward with a policy that no one really wants, that isn't helping anything, and that is going to hurt the most vulnerable in our society? So I think it's really important that this isn't just changed and that, we don't ignore the will of the people, so to speak. But I think it's important now with the new facts that we actually sit down, more than sit down, run around and knock on doors probably, have a debate, have another vote and make sure that we really fight to remain this time. I'm not massively enthusiastic about it all because I'm still very nervous about it. I think if we had a people's vote, what happened last time might be even worse. I think there'd be more lies. I think it'd be even more toxic. But I don't think that's a reason to run away from that debate. If we voted to leave, what would your stance be after that?
I mean, at the risk of sounding like a government minister, it's difficult to discuss a hypothetical. But in theory, if the vote had been run cleanly and fairly, there hadn't been lies, and it looked like the public really were saying, yes, we want to exit with no deal, or yes, we want to exit and have a Norway option. I think at that point you would have to move on to fighting to fighting to go back into the EU, if that makes sense. I don't think we could not leave indefinitely. If you're asking me, would there ever be a time in my life where I wouldn't say I think that there's a European Union that we need to fight for and we need to make happen, then I can't envisage a time when that would ever be. I really believe deeply in the principles of the European Union. I think we're stronger together than further apart. I think global problems require global solutions, and it looks like the world's problems are going to get worse, and we're going to need to work together more, not less.
Now, moving away from Brexit, of course, the left as a whole, I know that's a very kind of weird way of putting it, but there's been an ongoing problem with anti-Semitism. It's particularly rife among certain stories that have come out of the Labour Party, and I know you've been tweeting saying that it's actually something that's not completely dealt with in the Green Party. There's instances of it, across all different political parties. I noticed, and I mentioned at the start that, of course, you're the leader of the Jewish Greens, or co-founder, rather, of the Jewish Greens. What's your kind of opinion on the stance of the Green Party with regards to anti-Semitism? Because I saw you were tweeting earlier, is it Shara Ali, who is the Home Affairs spokesperson of the Green Party? What's kind of the situation there?
So the situation was that we were very similar to the Labour Party. We put forward a definition, the IHRA definition, which also includes a clause to say that it is not anti-Semitic to criticise Israel. From my point of view, that's very clear that that's saying Israel is a separate matter. We need a separate policy on that, and that's fine. But actually, this is about saying not even that you can't be anti-Semitic in public or in Britain, because, of course, that's now the law. The IHRA definition is the law. This was about very specifically saying within the Green Party, this is a culture that is friendly to Jewish people, that's inviting and welcome, and we're going to extend the same kind of rights and principles to Jewish people as we would to Muslim people, Christian people, or people of any faith or none. I guess you'd have to talk to Shirar about this because I don't want to misrepresent his position, but he came up with an alternative motion that to me is absolutely incoherent, that ignores the motion I co-proposed that said that it is not anti-Semitic to criticize Israel. So partly this is a little bit processy, but because we had this holistic review that I mentioned earlier, it meant that took up the majority of the weekend. And actually this anti-Semitic motion was an emergency motion that was awarded 20 minutes at the very end of the weekend. Now, I'm happy to criticize the Green Party, that I think any fair-minded person would look at the anti-Semitism debate and the time 20 minutes and go, that probably isn't a reasonable amount of time to have this debate. As such, it was, I won't mince my words, quite chaotic, quite toxic, quite heated. And I don't think that's because people are being anti-Semitic, but I think it's because people really fiercely and passionately believe in their right to criticize Israel. I would say it feels a bit obsessive at times. I think it's important to stand up against Netanyahu, but I think it's important to stand up against all oppression around the world. But it does seem that people particularly get very angsty if they feel like you're removing their right to criticize Israel in particular. So we had a debate on it, and then someone put forward a procedural motion to refer back both motions so that they could be rewritten, relooked at. A conversation could happen outside of conference when there'd be more time. I'm personally looking to rewrite a motion, which I'll be proposing, and hope to pass in spring. I don't want to excuse this, though. As I'm talking, it sounds like an excuse. I don't think it's okay. I'm deeply disappointed that it was rejected. I don't think it's a controversial motion. However, I do understand that in the very short amount of time that we had, people didn't get a chance to speak. I didn't get a chance to formally speak in the speech because time was so short. I did make a procedural motion, which was half speech, half procedure. But I think, in the future, it would be absolutely shameful and incoherent to not have a policy on anti-Semitism.
Moving on to a slightly lighter note surrounding the Jewish Greens, I noticed that you mentioned that one Larry Sanders was in attendance. So those people who don't know, Larry Sanders is the brother of prominent US politician Bernie Sanders, and he's obviously very active. I think it's within the Oxford Green Party. What's he like as a person to have him on board with the Green Party?
I don't know how kind of politically jargon this is, but he's a total dude. I met him for the first time at the conference. As I said, we wouldn't say co-founded. It was, I think, maybe 14 of us that have put together this Jewish Greens group, partly in response to kind of the anti-Semitism debate, but also on lots of issues like circumcision, on dietary requirements, on genetic health conditions specific to Ashkenazi Jews. So I think there's a whole series of Jewish issues specifically that, we can discuss and help the Greens formulate policy on. And Larry was at that meeting. He was across the table. I only clocked kind of halfway through the meeting when he started to speak who it was. And I thought I'd, after the meeting, ask him, for a selfie and just have a very quick moment of his time. And he gave me all the time in the world. And actually, we chatted for quite a while about world politics, about Jewish politics, about Green politics. He'd actually come over from the Labour Party, which I didn't know before he was in the Green Party.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And then neither did I. And we discussed my experiences with Liberal Democrats and various experiences there. And yeah, he was a great listener, a great chatter, and yeah, just a thoroughly charming man.
Brilliant. Where can people follow you on Twitter to keep up with what you're doing?
It's at Zack Polanski, so that's one way. And also, if there's any vegans listening, there's also at Vegan Greens.
Brilliant. Well, Zack Polanski,
thank
you.
Green Vegans.
Green Vegans. Brilliant.
There we go.
Well, Zack Polanski, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me and discussing green politics.